Most companies are getting AI wrong. They rush to bolt generative AI like ChatGPT onto every process, imagining that it will magically transform their business. But there are a few hidden mistakes that undermine AI success and almost guarantee failure. In this video, I'll break down the 3 biggest mistakes that I see companies make with AI and what you should do instead if you actually want results. Okay, mistake number 1. Choosing the wrong tool for a particular problem. One really big mistake that I'm seeing a lot of business leaders and entrepreneurs make is they're trying to use ChatGPT or a similar large language model to solve every problem. This comes from, I think, a misunderstanding about the nature of AI. They think that AI is synonymous with large language model, as if large language models are the only type of AI. This is incorrect. Large language models are really one type of AI, and you need to think about them as one tool in a broader AI toolkit. And in fact, I'd say that there are at least 3 or 4 major types of AI, LLMs being only one of them. So first, you have generative AI that includes large language models. You could also include in generative AI, generative image models that create images, or now generative video models. But generative AI, as the name implies, generate outputs. And LLMs generate specifically text-based outputs. So if you need to produce text-based outputs, things like paragraphs of text, you need to do some summarization, maybe some translation tasks. Or if you have a question and answer task, this is one of the things that people use large language models for very frequently right now, using it sort of like an advisor. LLMs are great for that, but they're not very good at many other things. So for example, things like prediction. So if you're going to do prediction task, like you need to predict maybe sales numbers or you need to predict churn in your business, you are not going to use a large language model. So that actually brings us to the second type of AI, which is supervised learning. We sometimes call these predictive models. Supervised learning predicts either categories typically or numbers. So supervised learning is really good at making precise predictions. Anytime you need to make a prediction in your business, it's very likely that you need a supervised learning system. The third type of AI is unsupervised learning. Unsupervised learning only finds structure in data. Unsupervised learning, it's actually really good for strategic purposes. We often use various types of unsupervised learning for either segmentation or product analysis. And you can essentially use it for marketing strategy, go-to-market strategy, product strategy, and a variety of other things. This is an entirely separate type of AI, and large language models don't really do that very well. You also have AI agents, which are kind of related to large language models, but they're different enough that they're sort of their own thing. And you could even go further. You have things like computer vision, which literally analyzes image data. We see this now in medical imaging, robotics, self-driving cars. What I'm trying to emphasize here is that there are multiple different types of artificial intelligence, and each one has strengths and weaknesses and various areas of application in a business. So if you're serious about using AI to increase revenue, increase profit, and grow your business, you need to, number 1, you need to understand the different types of AI. You need to understand their strengths and weaknesses. And you also need to understand the types of data that are required to run those systems, which actually brings us to our second major mistake. Okay, mistake number 2, ignoring data readiness. I think a lot of business leaders are really forgetting about data entirely because when they think about AI, they think about ChatGPT. You go to ChatGPT or Claude, you type in a question, it gives you an answer. But in many cases, even things like large language models will work better if you give them the appropriate information and context. So something that I think is going to become very important over the next year or 2 is a topic called context engineering, where you're essentially giving a large language model documents, better information, giving it access maybe to some databases and other systems. So it has enough information to give you a really good answer. You probably noticed that if you give an LLM like ChatGPT or Claude more information, it can usually give you a better answer if it knows more about the problem you're trying to solve. This essentially means giving it better data. And if you have that data in a structured form, let's say you take some of your documents, your processes, procedures, your SOPs, contracts, all of those documents, and if you put them into a document store, you'll have them in a cleaner format. And if you use that document store correctly, it can feed into a large language model and help it understand your business, your typical business problems, and give it more context when you ask it questions. So this is one example of data readiness, but there are others. If you're not using a large language model, if instead you're trying to make accurate predictions, you often need a lot of structured data. For classification and regression problems, you often need to build those systems using structured data. And if your data is messy or dirty or in the wrong format, your system isn't going to perform very well. Similarly, a couple of minutes ago, I talked about unsupervised learning, which is very good for solving certain types of strategic problems, finding patterns in data. You need the right data for that, and it needs to be in a particular form. So if you're serious about getting the most out of AI, that means large language models, that means AI agents perhaps in the future, that means making predictive models or solving certain types of strategic problems, you need the right data assets. So you should start by auditing your data assets, figuring out what you have, what you do not have but might want. You need to invest in organizing and cleaning that data, storing it in the right formats, and you'll ultimately need to think about building processes and procedures for auditing, maintaining, governing, cleaning, and distributing all of your data assets in order to use AI to maximum effect while also mitigating any of your risks. Mistake number 3, skipping validation, testing, and quality assurance. So this is a really big one. These AI systems make mistakes. I think almost everyone at this point is familiar with hallucination, when a large language model very confidently gives an answer to a question that's flat out wrong. So many people are kind of familiar with the idea that AI systems make mistakes. And because they can and do make mistakes, you need ways of validating and testing their outputs. Now, this is something that's a little bit difficult to do if you're strictly using ChatGPT, but I don't think that ChatGPT or Claude or similar systems are the right tool for most problems. Even if you need a large language model internally in your business, you should probably be taking an LLM and then doing some engineering around that system to make it perform better for the types of questions you're asking and the types of problems you're trying to solve with that tool, which means that you should be engineering an AI system particular to your business. But if you do that, like I said, then you need to start validating that the system works and is performing well. So how do you do that? Well, you need to pick the right metrics. Is it factual consistency? Are you evaluating for toxicity? Things like that. And that's for large language models. If you're using a predictive model, you're going to be using different metrics. If you have a classifier that might be predicting something like churn or upsell propensity, you're going to be looking at metrics like recall and precision. These are very important metrics for classification systems. If you're using a predictive model to predict numbers like sales numbers, you might be using something like R squared and so on. So you need to first pick the right metric. You also need to set baselines for the performance. Essentially, when you are trying to figure out if a model is good or bad, you need to ask the question, compared to what alternative? For example, if a predictive model gets the right answer 75% of the time, but you have a third-party technology system that can get it right 90% of the time, the predictive model isn't doing very well. So you always need to ask, compared to what? You need to benchmark. Furthermore, you should have ongoing monitoring processes that monitor these models and make sure that their performance is consistent over time. This is partially because models tend to break down, they tend to drift. As new data inputs come in, things that might be different from the data on which a model was built or trained, the model performance can degrade over time. We literally call this model drift, and it's something that you need to watch out for. So if you're just using a system thinking it's going to perform well consistently forever, you're probably in for a very nasty surprise 6 to 12 months down the line. And then for certain types of systems, you should have a human in the loop for certain types of operations. This, I think, will be very important for AI agents. It's also true for certain types of classic systems. You might have a predictive system make an observation, and then if it's a little bit unsure, it might actually send the really difficult cases to a human being. So the AI system does its thing on the sort of easier cases, and if it has low certainty on one of its answers, it might send that problem off to a human being. You keep an expert in the loop, and it makes the system overall perform better when it's a combination of AI and human. Without this type of validation, testing, quality assurance, and ongoing monitoring, systems are much more likely to fail and make mistakes, and over time, it can erode trust. So make sure you're doing testing, validation, QA, and ongoing monitoring. Okay, so these 3 mistakes, picking the wrong AI technique, ignoring data readiness, and failing to do QA, validation, and testing, these are 3 of the biggest reasons why so many AI initiatives are stalling out. Remember, the companies that win in the AI era won't be those that just use ChatGPT or try to build a chatbot for everything. They're going to be the ones that think very strategically about how to use AI. The best companies are going to diagnose their actual problems, pick the right technique, figure out what data they need and how to get it into the best format, and then they'll test and validate those systems to make sure that they work well and monitor them over time to make sure that they continue to perform. So if you want AI to drive real revenue and profit in your business, you need to treat it like an engineering problem. If you found this helpful, hit like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments, what AI problems and mistakes have you seen in your own company?